talk, but we'll pick up. Okay, so in this 90 minutes, we're going to talk about exclusively the topic of investigative interviewing and psychological contributions to that field. And I think that the way we should use the time is that first I'll run through some of the prepared things that I want to be sure to cover, and then we'll finish up with your comments and discussion, drawing together the material from the videos, which I hope you've watched, in relating those to some of the other material that I present. And we probably will focus tomorrow on detection of deception. So some of the material that you viewed that really talked about lying might be more relevant to tomorrow's discussion than to today's, but let's see how it goes. All right, so there have been great advances made, I would say, in the past decade or two on the topic of effective questioning. And questioning is a core legal skill, and it applies as much to lawyer interviews as it does to police interviews, or to lawyer questioning in a courtroom, as it does to investigative interviews in precursors of trials. So it is also very fundamental to our communication. So it's really, I think, a topic where you can take some of the principles that come out of this research and possibly apply them in ordinary interactions and other professional arenas as much as in policing. What has been examined is differences between what are evidence-based interviews and traditional standard interviews without that training. And the standard interviews tend to have far more closed-ended questions than open, far more interruptions of the interviewee, many more rapid-fire questions without a pause or a chance for people to complete their answers, far more of a focus that is confession-oriented, trying to secure admissions in one way or another, usually with closed-ended questions. And also poor sequencing of the questions, so jumping around from topic to topic, mixing up the order rather than in any other sort of logical or unfolded way. And so some of the issues are whether that's effective or not. So this body of research addresses that. I will speak later in detail more about the accusatory versus information gathering strategies, but those are good labels to learn in trying to capsulize what is the change that has occurred in the policing arena in these developments. Because the information gathering approach really focuses more on hearing the story, getting an account from the interviewee rather than securing an outcome. And some of the features that really have been developed are how to get more cooperation rather than have people close down and not continue to cooperate and talk to police officers or invoke their right to silence where that's probably their rights. So legislation, again, is usually the background or underpinning for much of what we're going to be talking about. In our Australian context, there is a Uniform Evidence Act, and that includes prohibitions against pressure to get someone to confess. So if that's found to be present in one form or another, then that evidence is excluded at trial. And there are specific statutory provisions there saying it can't be influenced by either violence or other oppressive strategies, inhuman or degrading conduct, whether it's to the interviewee or to someone that they know or someone outside of the interview, or any threats of that sort of conduct. So there are examples in our book of cases thrown out on that basis. For example, where police have used, the good cop, bad cop routine, saying, there's an easy way for you to deal with these questions, or you can do it the hard way if you prefer. And the police have said that's impermissible, coercive kind of practice, and anything that was said in those circumstances was not allowed. We also have the LEPRA Act, or Law Enforcement Powers and Responsibilities Act, which requires that interviewees be given medical treatment, refreshments, ordinary facilities, that if they don't want to continue, their wishes be respected, and that there are limits prescribed by statute on how long you can question someone for. And we do make a distinction between high-stakes terror-related offenses and others. So we have special legislation, which is very controversial, in terror-related crimes where instead of the 4-hour maximum, you can hold someone and question them for 20-hour maximums, and I think both of those periods you can apply for permission from the court to extend them or double them. Since 1995, all interviews have compulsorily been recorded to change abuses that were acknowledged to have come out of that Royal Wood Commission that I mentioned, of the practice of verbaling or suggesting responses that you desire in an interview and documenting those whether or not they're volunteered. What has been found in studies done, for example, by David Dixon in Australia, is that that didn't necessarily stop police officers from conducting pre-interview questioning and then turning on the video recorder and starting with things that didn't reflect entirely all the communications. So it's there have been issues in trying to prohibit those sorts of abuses. Another subtle set of issues to come out of the psychological research that I think is really intriguing is the impact of videotaping on perceptions through the camera angle. And Dan Lester in the United States is one of the proponents of this research, along with Chris Meisner, whose interview you watched. And they found that depending on what was filmed, people perceived the interviewee to be more or less guilty. It was quite dramatic and statistically significant differences between conditions. So if you have a camera focus on the face of the interviewee only, they look very guilty. You identify then as the viewer with the police officer, who's trying to ascertain whether the person is guilty, and so somehow that is transferred to your perceptions. It is better, therefore, to film the interview from the interviewee's perspective and show the police officer's face, and that reduces guilt ratings in this one study that was done, down to 5% from over 40% in some other conditions. If you just use an audio tape and no picture, the guilt ratings were still fairly low. If you have a picture that includes both the interviewer and the interviewee in the same frame, as is mandatory, I think now in Japan and New Zealand, then the guilt ratings were less than if you just looked at the interviewee, around 40%, so much higher than the other. These are very dramatic outcomes, and yet very few countries have implemented any legislation on standards for video recorded evidence. Switching from one to the other is sometimes a practice in New South Wales to try to provide equivalence and break it up. So there is a set of standards that have started to be developed. These come out of the Netherlands, and I can give you the resource if you're interested. And they've called them the True to Life Video Display Standards, and they might apply equally to police interviews as well as to CCTV evidence played in court. Very few courts actually adhere to these yet. This is a work in progress. Courts are struggling technologically to get these things in place, but there are a host of things that tend to influence the way that the participants are perceived when they appear on film. And so there's not enough research there even to show you the outcomes. All right, so turning now more to some of the techniques of the questioning itself. We will come back when we deal with deception to the Reed-Inbound model in particular, or the behavioral analysis of interviews, so I'm not going to dwell on that now. I think it's important to realize that hypnosis has sometimes been admitted in some courts, but is often regarded as admissible only with certain strings of conditions attached. And this is an individual difference variable as well. So studies have shown that some people are highly susceptible to hypnosis and others not at all. And so you can't just presume that if you sit down and apply hypnotic techniques to somebody that you're going to get the same sorts of outcomes. It might vary a lot. It's very related to suggestibility, because hypnosis is a form of suggestion. And so all of the things that we will be saying about suggestibility and questioning later on in the course really do apply to the hypnotic research as well. It's generally of lesser concern than just fundamental questioning, so I'm not going to dwell on that. You can follow some of the research that we summarized in our textbook. The British model has been widely adopted in many countries, including Australia. It's called the PEACE model. It's more a set of procedures than anything else. And so the PEACE acronym stands for preparation and planning, engaging and explaining conditions to the interviewee, getting their account, doing a formal closure where you ask them certain questions to check that they told you over the call, and then evaluating what you got. So it doesn't tell you much about how to do the questioning, it just tells you this sort of sequence, but that is what we use. Rapport building is really what we're going to focus on today, because as you may have gathered from the interview, that's really a critical feature in the current research that seems to make a difference. So that is a social psychological issue, and all of the research on social influence relates to building rapport with people in order to engage in interviews that are non-coercive. Some of that really drew on some other precursors in psychology from clinical interviews or conversation management theory, how to have conversations, encouraging people to give you open-ended narratives rather than suggest ideas to them. And that's being implemented in much of the rapport building and interviewing strategies in contemporary police departments. The cognitive interview is one of the interviews you will have heard people talk about on the videotapes. And that is quite a well-established set of more cognitive psychology principles drawing on memory-based research. And there are a host of strategies that are part of the cognitive interview. The critical ones are you get people to reimagine themselves in the context that they're describing, because it has been found that if you remember something in a similar or mentally simulated context in which it occurred, you do a better and more complete job of it. So if you take your examinations in the same room where you did the studying, you perform better than if you take them in a different room, because the context is more associated with that knowledge. And you're exploiting that same principle in the cognitive interview. You encourage people to report everything, even if it seems irrelevant to the interviewee, because you want a complete account, because you adopt the position as the interviewer that you don't know at the time what's going to be important or not important in terms of what they're relating. And you also encourage people to report things forwards as well as backwards, because if you change the sequence, you might get more details when they use different retrieval cues. So when we talk about memory, we'll talk a bit about retrieval strategies, but that's where that comes from. And you also get people to adopt different perspectives, so try to imagine if they were viewing a crime scene, how it would look from this angle or that side of the room instead, to try to see if we can extract any more information. And when this has been evaluated, especially using what is called the cognitive interview revised version, the most recent version, when compared to traditional questioning, people produce 45% more information. So its information gain and information yield is striking, and its major strength. And then, the issue becomes for the interviewer, are you getting good, solid, reliable information? Is it usable? Is it viable intelligence? So a very important dimension to interviewing that we will spend little time on, unfortunately, I think today, mainly because the research on this isn't as well developed, is the necessity to make cultural adaptations, just as you would for any test. And so some of us were talking in the break about speech styles and communication styles of different cultures. In Australia, work done with some of our Indigenous communities in policing interviews has shown that there are differential uses of pauses. So long pauses, for people who come from Western kinds of cultures are seen as negative, and people infer that you must be about to try to lie or deceive me because you're just using all this time to think of something else, to make up to answer the question. Whereas in Indigenous culture, long pauses are very normal and part of the ordinary communication, and nobody draws any negative inferences from them. So if you're a judge from one culture taking evidence from people from another, you might misinterpret simple things such as how long there is a time lapse between a question and a response. Similarly, our members of our Indigenous community are often trained to respond affirmatively, to say yes, especially to be polite to strangers. In communities where they're not well known. And so if you say yes to every question from a police officer, you tend to get convicted at a very high rate compared to others. And so knowing that there is a propensity simply to agree, irrespective of the underlying veracity of a statement, is a really important cultural difference variable in our community. So our judges and magistrates are trained about that now. And there may be many other dialect differences that might lead to problems or require interpreters, which was a topic. So I wanted to focus on some work done recently on non-coercive interviewing techniques in particular. And I just need to go back, I think. And I think the reason that these have become a focus is that there has been an increasing body of evidence showing that coercive strategies don't necessarily produce useful information and may encourage people simply to answer a question in any possible way, and particularly the way that they think the interviewer would desire them to answer, in order to terminate the interview, particularly if it's accompanied by stressful attributes or any form of discomfort or torture. Then the motivation is to end that, and the fastest way to end it is to simply say what you think somebody is trying to get you to say. And recent releases in the United States of large-scale reports on this kind of strategy really do document that, and those are available online. And so if you're interested in that body of work documenting that, I would encourage you to track down those reports released in the last year or so, and I can help you get those things if you wish. The research on developing rapport really is what I'm going to focus on, and part of what is really important about that is that there's been a shift in the models from the focus on the interviewee or focus on just the interview as strategy to much more of a focus on the dynamic between them. And that's why rapport has its place. And there are differences to attend to as well that are cultural in nature. And as I've indicated, that's research that is still ongoing, but there have been marked differences in how people respond in what are called high context versus low context cultures. And high context cultures tend to be those that are more collective, and low context cultures tend to be those that are much more individualistic, typically very Western in their value systems. A lot of the collectivist cultures are more Eastern cultures. So you would have to think about where you would place India in that spectrum. There is some wonderful work done by an organizational psychologist. Hofstede is his name, who has produced a classification matrix for all countries and cultures, showing which are high on individualism and collectivism, as well as 6 or 7 other quite fascinating dimensions. You can compare cultures, to see how they behave, and that can help in predictions on those sorts of issues that we want to address today. So I'm going to talk about 2 studies very quickly that are related with respect to rapport building. And this first one was particularly to explore social influence strategies that have proven very successful in the sales and marketing arena, drawing on the work of Cialdini, who, if you look him up, is really a kind of a guru in social persuasion. So he's a social psychologist who has really identified those 6 principles of social influence as very effective in order to persuade people to buy something if you're marketing goods. And so the issue is how well they might work in other social circumstances as well. So I want to make sure that you understand what they are. Reciprocity is pretty easy to understand. That is usually where you try to obligate somebody by giving them something, or possibly, in an interview situation, you might self-disclose something and then hope to get more disclosures from an interviewee in reciprocation. Sometimes it can be, though, just physical goods that are given, refreshments or whatever, making somebody more comfortable, giving them something that they want, and then obligating them, therefore, to be more cooperative. So that's that principle. The second one, commitment and consistency, in the marketing world is really regarded more as the foot in the door. You get somebody to make a small concession, and then you use that as a basis to try to get pattern behavior that is similar, because people do have a desire to appear consistent to their peers and in social situations, and so you're capitalizing on that motivation to be consistent, especially after you've made little commitments. So you try to get a small concession and see if you can make it grow and expand. Social proof is really the notion that you will conform with what is patterned towards you, so that if somebody behaves towards you in a certain way, you will mirror it or mimic it and reflect it back. Authority is the persuasiveness of whatever might be an authority to the interviewee. So it might be a religious leader, it might be a teacher, it might be a member of the family, it might be simply the authority of the police, but you're appealing to somebody who appears to be an authority to see whether that has persuasive value. Sometimes they can be social authorities. That's often used in marketing. So some movie star endorses a product, they're seen as a social authority in some fashion, and we are, encouraged to mimic them because of their social authority, and therefore buy whatever we see them using. And so, that can be used as well if the interviewer is clever enough to figure out what might be social authorities for that interview. Affinity is simply the notion that if the interviewer can figure out what the interviewee likes or has as attributes, they reflect similar ones. So if an interviewee says, "I have 2 children," the interviewer might say, "So do I," and try to build that affinity or solidarity, in terms of commonalities. Okay? Scarcity means the persuasive value of something that is desirable but unattainable generally that you provide. And so if you know what an interviewee wants and you're able to offer it as part of your interview strategy, providing something that is valued because of its scarcity might be persuasive. This capitalizes on the marketing principle of, there are only 2 or 3 of this left, so grab it now if you want. Sure. So those are, you might be skeptical that they might work in an interview situation at all. So that was what this research set out to investigate. because they are tried and true marketing principles. So in order to do this, with funding that I had from the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group that was depicted in some of those videos, I conducted some interviews with high value detainee interviewers, in other words, people from various police forces or military agencies, and I went to those countries in particular to gather these data, and used a structured interview questionnaire that had been used by one of the interviewers that spoke on the video, Melissa Rosada, you may remember. I think she was talking about interviews that she conducted in the USA, done with the same questionnaire. So it covers a broad range of topics. We audio taped everything that the interviewer said, de-identified them, transcribed them, and then thematically analyzed them. And as part of our analysis, we focused very much on, in this paper that I'm talking about, just on 6 questions about rapport that I'll show you. And we wanted to look at those Cialdini principles to see whether they surfaced. So none of our participants knew that we were interested in Cialdini's theory. None of our participants was primed at all about any of those words that I just elaborated for you. And when we set out to do the study, we didn't know that at the end of it we would try to apply Cialdini's theory to what they said about rapport. So there's no possibility that we had influenced them to use those terms or examples. We again did some dual coding to make sure that it was robust. So these were the questions they asked. Very broad, open-ended questions about rapport. You know, what do you think rapport is in an interview? Is it important? If so, why not? How do you go about developing rapport with the person sitting opposite you in the interview? Are there some things about your personality that you tend to rely on to develop rapport, or things that you realize are weaknesses in your own development of rapport that you need to overcome? So we want to give them positives or negatives. We didn't want to assume anything about what they thought. How do you know when you've got rapport? And what strategies do you think are either very effective or very ineffective? So that was all they were asked on those issues. This just shows you very quickly who we had responses from in the various countries. So we had an over-representation of people from the Australian Counter-Terrorist Unit compared to other countries where, with limited time and resources, we obtained fewer participants. When we looked at their background, you know, there were various. Some were military or police officers, others were specialists in criminal investigations or other kinds of specialist agencies. Some were exclusively military, and some really only did intelligence work. I think that was primarily the South Koreans, because the sample that we had access to were Korean intelligence officers. Okay, so we looked at how experienced they were, and they were generally very experienced, with, you know, over 70% of them more than 10 years doing just these kinds of interviews, and 63% of them reported conducting well over 100 of these sort of high-value interviews. So what did we learn? Well, all of the reported techniques could be classified as fitting into one or more of Cialdini's forms of persuasion. And affinity and liking were the most frequently enumerated, very well used. Oftentimes via similarities that were reflected between the interviewer and the interviewee, and sometimes through use of humor, you know, very deliberately. And we even found examples where people capitalized on dissimilarity to build that affinity, you know. So, it could happen in various ways. But people were incredibly adept at using these principles in innovative ways, and that sort of dissimilarity effect was one of those. Reciprocity was the most ubiquitously used of strategies. And then we found that some of them tended to be more culturally bound, so they were used in certain cultures and not so much in others, and those were the social proof and authority kind kinds of strategies. So here are the percentages. So you can see liking and affinity and reciprocity very high, then a big drop off in terms of authority, commitment, very little in terms of scarcity or social proof. So what's an example of the affinity or liking? Well, one interviewer here from Indonesia was talking about how to develop rapport with jokes, and gave an example of saying to the interviewee, "Are you married?" If the interviewer said yes, then he would say, "Well, how many times?" and would smile, and this would reduce some of the resistance and generate humor in the situation. So there are many examples of all of these, and I'm going to give you all of the slides, and I think that I just don't want to use up all of our discussion time by working through all of the examples that you can read on your own. But you can see that, over here, again, here, the discomfort of a Tamil tiger's female who'd been very senior in the organization in Sri Lanka, really was able to develop rapport in this case by capitalizing on her feelings that her own community had let her down. And so you just don't know what will work, but people were adept in using these strategies. And so I'm going to skip over, these unfortunately just come up one by one. I'm going to skip over a lot of the examples and jump to some of the conclusions of this study and then move on to the others. So clearly these were self-reports without us having on hand the actual interviews that they were summarizing from a body of their experience, so we could not cross-validate what was being said. I think that's perfectly acceptable to do that sort of work for preliminary kinds of research, as this was. It would need to be replicated by actually doing the same sort of analysis with video recordings of police interviews, but it is exceptionally difficult to extract those from most police agencies in order to do that kind of research. I would say that there seemed to be a gap between the perceived importance of some of these features and practice. We didn't know whether the most frequently reported strategy was also the most effective because we didn't have the interviews in which to test that. And I think that what is an important limitation as well is that the mere presence of rapport doesn't mean that there was cooperation in terms of the targets of the interview. So how far does it really get you was still an open question. So that those are clear limitations. But we did find general support for social persuasion, even in the high-stakes interviews, from a broad variety of agencies and cultures. And we had a separate online survey to similar populations that corroborated this with a different sample. And I think it helps to develop what I consider to be international best practices on this topic, which is a growing concern, and also highlight a lot of future research that needed to be done. So in our next wave of funding, we were able to get some money to do some additional work, and this time we focused on that cooperation variable to try to see whether there was more of a relationship between the rapport and, in fact, cooperation, and not only just cooperation, but meaningful cooperation in terms of producing disclosures that were helpful. And so in this case, we were interested more in contrasting those outcomes when people reported the use of coercive and non-coercive strategies. And we wanted to see which of those strategies prompted disclosure and how fast as well, because do you just want to have an endless interview where you go on with rapport, talking and talking and talking? Is there a payoff, or are there certain things that that seem to be timed and effective for practice? So I, after that first study, tried to analyze all of the data in terms of this kind of matrix, and I distinguished various strategies that could be classified into 4 types. Some that seem to be sort of legal in the way they were used, and some that seem to be more physical, others that seem to be more mental or cognitive, and others that seem to be more social. And so we took about the social ones, but none of the others. But in this study, I wanted to take into account all of those others as well. So I want to make sure that you understand how each of them might have an array on a spectrum that could go from coercive to non-coercive. So for example, if we look at the physical dimension, if you are using coercive physical techniques, those might include isolation, restraints on the interviewee, using extreme changes in temperature, or possibly going on to assaultive techniques or other kinds of waterboarding and so on. And we heard about all of these. So those were contrasted with other sorts of physical strategies, such as providing very comfortable physical settings, providing creature comforts in terms of food, refreshments that were desired, or special meals, frequent breaks, and soft furnishings and so forth. How effective is the one versus the other is really the pivotal question. And so each of those dimensions, had a coercive and a non-coercive attribute in our studies. So just examples of differences in physical settings. At the top, that is a typical counter-terrorist interview room in Australia. And on the right, we have in Sweden the interview room used for Anders Breivik's interview, which you can see is very soft furnishings, nice curtains, comfortable armchairs, nothing at all, like the poky little interview room with its windowless in Australia. And then there's another picture there of a Japanese interview room where an interpreter is present, larger, slightly different in the Australian context. So there's a lot of variability around the world in the settings physically. Though we did find in our interviews that sometimes people took detainees to non-police sites for the interviews, including, some unmarked buildings or hotels that were not part of typical police premises. And usually that was to engage in strategies that were more coercive in some fashion or another. So it's not always the formal premises and interview rooms that one used. Right, so this study focused on perceptions of 2 groups, the practitioners as well as detainees, of interviews that were high stakes. And as I said, we were interested in cooperation, disclosure, timing, and admissions. What we did in this study was we tried to distinguish whether just more information was also more helpful, because that's emerged as an issue in the literature. So we interviewed these groups in 5 different countries, and I've listed them there. It was a convenient sample, not a random sample, because it was very difficult to get access to detainees in particular, but also very difficult to get access to a random sample of police practitioners in this case, and so that is a limitation. We recruited people via their employers, via their lawyers, via correctional institutions if they were in jail somewhere, and via research networks of people who do terrorist kind of research. Those were our entrees to the sample. And listed there is the group of police practitioners' sources that helped us to contact interviewees. Most of these interviews lasted for approximately an hour, and this was a quantitative and qualitative set of analyses, so a mixed sort of design. Our hypotheses were that the detainees would report more coercive strategies than the practitioners, and that both of them, however, would see the non-coercive as more effective than the coercive approaches. in getting cooperation disclosures more rapidly and just moving up. Our practitioner sample was 34 individuals in the analyses I'm reporting here, and most of those had dealt with terror suspects. I think in Australia we got slightly more who had dealt with non-terror suspects compared to other countries. The detainee group, about 30 of them were all terror suspects in those different countries, and I listed, you know, educational background of individuals as well, just so that you know that they were varied. We used a semi-structured interview, so we had the same set of questions for all, and we asked them to please remember one interview in which somewhere in that interview there was a change, and the change was either that initially the interviewee was non-disclosive and then became cooperative and disclosive, or the flip side. You know, that they started out cooperative and disclosive and then they closed down and wouldn't say any more. So we didn't care which way the interview went, we just were interested in the dynamic and that change and what led to the change according to their perceptions. So we asked them about the arrest, preparation done for the interviews, strategies used in those categories, perceived responses, because again we didn't have videotapes of what happened, and the demographics. And the interviews were done mostly in person, occasionally one or two by Skype, when we were doing the Philippine interviews, because the interviewees mostly didn't speak English, we had to have a research collaborator, and that was also true in a few of the cases with Indonesians or Tamil speakers. So overall, what did they talk about? Well, we had, you know, about 64 people. They talked about 75 different interview experiences, because some of them insisted on recounting more than one, and we coded those as well. Most of them, 87%, were terrorism cases. 13% fell into other categories like homicide, assault, home invasion. Below, I've listed the various terrorist groups that were represented in our detainee sample or reported by our interviewer sample, so they were, definitely high stakes. The age of our practitioners was slightly older in general than the detainee group, in most situations, there were at least 2 to 3 interviewers present in the interview room. A small percentage, less than 1 in 5, had interpreters present. The interview duration was quite lengthy, but enormous variability. That median duration of 7.5 hours doesn't capture the sort of multiple days and multiple months in some cases where, especially I think in the Philippines, all of the detainees had been in prison for many years without charges being brought. And so they were interviewed often many times over the course of that detention period, still without charges eventually. Half of the interviews in the police facility either done, at arrest sites or sometimes, as I mentioned, in the community non-police premises. About half of them reported that the interview that they were describing had a comfortable set, and 1/3 were comfortable, a third they were just neutral, and about half were described as uncomfortable in nature. And not always was a record of interview maintained by the interviewee. We found quite a lot of variability there. 1/3 videotaped, 1/4 audio taped, some just used written notes, and in some cases there was no record of interview whatsoever. So I had hoped that we could get records of all of these interviews at the end of our data collection and use those as well in the study, but that proved very difficult. So we transcribed our data and then analyzed them to try to look for those relationships of interest. So our predictive variables were those dimensions of the legalistic strategies, cognitive, social, or physical strategies, and And our outcome variables were cooperation, disclosures, and speed. And those are the subcategories that we used in coding. So you produce this kind of complicated path analysis map, but I'm going to just present you the outcomes in prose over here. What we found was that the accusatorial strategies where reported were perceived as less effective. They were most commonly reported compared to information gathering, and they were positively correlated with physical coercion and negatively correlated with social persuasion. So if it was an accusatorial kind of interview or guilt presumptive kind of interview, then they were far less likely to use any social persuasion strategies. Half of the detainees were rated as mostly cooperative. What you find when you look at research, as you will have heard in the video tape, is that a certain proportion of people come to an interview once they know it's going to happen, and they're going to be disclosive and cooperative, no matter what the interviewer does. And it's usually about 25 to 33% of all interviewees who fall into that group. So the focus is really on the 3/4 or 2/3 of those who are not already going to disclose and respond and be cooperative from the outset. 1 in 5 of our detainees reported what was classifiable as torturous abuse, if you look at the official definitions. Comfortable physical settings were strongly correlated and associated with social persuasive strategies, so those went hand in hand. When people used evidence in a confrontative way, that tended to decrease cooperation, so it was not an effective strategy in general. There's quite a lot of research on how it's used. So somebody pulls out, results of, a DNA test or photographic evidence or recording and confronts the detainee with that and asks them to account for it, that usually backfires in terms of reducing cooperation. So you have to be very careful, is the take-home message about how you use evidence strategically and when you use it if you want to capitalize on getting cooperation and disclosures. Regarding speed of disclosure, immediate disclosure, as I said, is very independent of the strategy. We found that the socially non-coercive strategies, such as the rapport building ones that we've described earlier, led to far earlier disclosures. And particularly effective were reliance on the liking principle, the affinity principle, humor, mutual interests. And if we converted those to odds ratios so that we could get some kind of quantitative indication of how effective, that showed that early disclosure was 14 times more likely when rapport building was the major interviewing strategy, when those social persuasion strategies were used. So it made a huge difference. Reciprocity tended to be correlated more with later disclosure in an interview, so was less effective in that way. The coercive strategies were seen as more ineffective by 59 versus 15% in securing information. Physical coercion, intimidation, deception on the behalf of the interviewers was generally affiliated with false information or no information. And that's where, I'll give you some quotes. The interviewees are telling us, I deliberately lied in response to this kind of strategy for whatever reason. With respect to the non-coercive strategies, turning those more into odds ratios so that you can get an idea of how effective, they were 6 times more likely to lead to cooperation on behalf of the interviewee, 5 times more likely to elicit reliable information. 56% of those yielded cooperation, 49% reliable information, 20%, as far as we could tell, led to true admissions of guilt. There were some non-coercive strategies too that produced cooperation in terms of, personal support, physical comfort, memory facilitation, the procedural justice kinds of variables. We coded for those as well. But rapport, I think, overall was the most important. Those that seemed to produce information were the same, but specific ways that evidence was used in conjunction with non-coercive strategies was also effective. So looking at the legal strategies that evidence use in coercive versus a non-coercive fashion is clearly critical if you want to get information disclosure. So here's what the detainees gave us feedback on regarding coercive experiences. They were frank about saying that that sort of approach led people to say anything. Some even said that they made up their answers, because they were subjected to electric shocks. Others said there was information that was not true because they could tell that the police were making things up, and so they went along. They made things up too. There was just no integrity to what the police were doing in asking questions, and that led them to respond as if it were a sham. And others spoke about the jeopardy that the police face when they use excessive force because it produces a response in kind. The interview advice that they gave was to be calm and friendly, to be flexible, to be understanding, to be gentle. They often refer to some of those procedural justice variables as well, telling interviewers to be fair. That would promote voluntary cooperation and disclosure, and that neutrality was important, and that they spoke about the importance too of comfortable interview settings. So they themselves recognized that made a difference in how much people would cooperate and disclose. So when we wrapped it all up, we felt that we did have evidence from this set of data collection that despite some of our limitations in sampling and the fact that we didn't have the actual interviews to work from, we were able to analyze the data and show that there was more reliable and complete disclosure with the non-coercive strategies, especially with rapport building and including reciprocity, and that what seemed to promote false information was deceptive strategies where people faked evidence or pretended to have evidence that didn't exist, or coerced, intimidated, sometimes verbally abused or physically abused interviewees, and that more training was needed on those sorts of strategies. All right, so I think I've managed in the first hour then to cover all of the formal sort of research presentation that I wanted to make, because most of that is not yet even in the textbook. It is still, I think, one or two bits are published, but there's more that we're still trying to publish, so I wanted to let you have that information because you can't really access it very easily elsewhere. And what I'd like to do at this point is give you a chance to ask questions, to make comments, and also to draw on the videotapes from other researchers in other jurisdictions doing this work. Just in the next 30 minutes, let's have a general discussion about things either on the interviewing in particular, or also some of the other material that we covered earlier. Okay, so let's kick off.
When it comes to eliciting truth, in police it is interrogation method, in courts it is cross-examination, and in psychology it is human-centered, person-centered, structured, non-structured way of interview techniques, which they use mostly like rapport building with empathy, respect, and all those variables. Most of these, the third one will is said to have given positive results in eliciting truth. You have used a heterogeneous population, if I'm not wrong. The percentage of population applying this technique seems to be heterogeneous. But still, the results say, whether the study that you have quoted or any other study says that human-centered or person-centered interviews give the best result. Having said that, what type of, is it completely unstructured interview techniques that you have used, where you are building a rapport which takes a lot of time, or structured interviews with questionnaires? And if so, can we have a view of those questionnaires?
Sure. Okay, so that's about my data collection, not about the structured questions that the police interviewers are using. Yes, you're welcome to get copies of we had a structured interview questionnaire, and then when we did an online survey, we actually had an experimental part to it as well as more open-ended parts to it. So we manipulated the kind of interview that was described so that we did a randomized assignment of our participants to either a non-coercive interview, a coercive interview, or a mixed one where an interviewee starts out being cooperative and then becomes uncooperative. And I can share that with you as well. So if you just email me, I'm happy to provide you with those copies so that you can have a look at the data collection instruments.
I wanted to sort of shift focus somewhere and look at this entire kind of data and evidence more from the stance of, excuse me, how we deal with the issue of outlying torture. Outlying combative kind of coercive techniques of investigation. And largely, as law people, we tend to sort of, make a normative thing and say, this is what you can do, can't do. And you try in as many ways to circumscribe, investigators' discretion and way of operating, because to say that, no, that's not where you should go. I was just wondering if we were to start to talk about these issues, not from a morality and other kind of point, but were to take the more pragmatic and effectiveness route. It kinds of is promoting fairness, that's for sure. But generally the fairness thing is jettisoned at the, at the altar of effectiveness. And to say, oh God, there is a ticking bomb and you want us to go in this soft, nice, building rapport, being sweet to people, it's not going to yield any sort of, and it's sort of exposing so many people to this. So I was really wondering as to where, if we were to look at there is a large normative framework for saying you shan't do the coercive. And yet you keep finding evidence on a repeated kind of basis of the coercive techniques being used. Because, at least I can say a large amount of our popular literature, our, the films and the media, it's like if you want to get it out, if you want to get the truth and fast, then the guy has to be slapped around. And that's the only way in which it can happen, So I was just saying that how much of this has gone into discourse, how much of this is being made more commonly available, and don't you think that most of our argumentation against torture should come from this kind of a basis rather than taking the totally normative line of this is not desirable, hence should not be done. Because that hasn't worked either. It's like you've done it, you've enhanced the normative package, whether it's international law, whether it is the kind of things which is coming as guidelines, reports, whether it's legislative constrictions. And the general attitude of a lot of popular representation is they're not letting us do our business. And they're kind of letting all of these criminals hold the entire society to ransom. Whereas if we were to just do some, you know, like a little slapping around and everything will come pouring out. So that was actually the thought when I kept listening in, that this sort of hard evidence, which with its all its limitations, I'm not on to, because to start a discourse would look like a better place to move from, even for human rights activists and people who are stressing that this kind of behavior is not on. To say it doesn't work. I was just wondering whether, I mean, that was actually the thought which kind of came. You further fine-tune what other evidence you give is a different thing. And that tied up with your recommendation for training. So when it's talking about training of whether it's police officials, whether it's investigative people, or whether it is even of judges. Because, you know, for them to comprehend, and if this kind of thing, say, starts coming in judgments, that don't do it because there is this sort of data which is demonstrating that it's not going to work. So, and that was, for me, the thought trigger. I felt that maybe then that connecting up with the video and what we found there is another issue. But I just by looking at the slides, I'm kind of holding back on the video because I think other people may have stuff to say.
And you know, and again, I mean it's a wonderful question. I think we feel very fortunate from a human rights standpoint that the data turned out this way. You know, what would I be saying if our data had turned out another way? If we had in fact found, you know, that it was the coercive techniques that were most effective, then we would be dealing with a much more obvious confrontation with the human rights approach. And so the compatibility of them sort of, you know, creates a different opportunity for the researchers that might otherwise exist. That, you know, that's unforeseen. You don't know how your data will turn out, and you've got to deal with interpreting them and using them at the end of the day. But, you know, again, is that question that you're asking really something that we can answer with more data, or is that an advocacy and policy uptake question? What do you think the response is of police communities? You know, and maybe you'd like to help us through the answer in terms of what you think is going to be most persuasive to police, you know, as communities. Is it the human rights end of it, or is it the effectiveness end of it? Not only for police, but for courts as well, that have to rely on how the police are conducted.
I think Sanat, we wanted to talk about.
From the police perspective, you're right. The human rights perspective is least persuasive, in the sense we tend to be very defensive when such issues are forefront. Just a thought. Now, most of the research here, like, look at the interviewee, their propensity to disclose, and perhaps their vulnerability, the